And so today we're particularly going to be exploring the recent aggression between Israel and Iran, in which Israel bombed Iran, claiming it was an act of self-defense. And when Iran has retaliated, that has been called an attack in our mainstream media and condemned by our governments that are complicit in a genocide of 21 months in Gaza. Hello everyone, thank you again for joining us, Khadija here and my dad.
Hi.
Alex. And so we are going to be continuing our conversations around the current theme of hydropolitics, water, ontology of law, resources and necropolitics. Today we're doing a walking conversation by the river. We've returned to that format as we've been doing a lot of writing and research and just need to take a slightly gentler approach this week. Just a quick reminder of what the theme is. It's about water is life, power, and the site of conflict. Hydropolitics explores how legal and economic systems transform water into an instrument of control, reinforcing imperial dominance, environmental destruction, and systemic inequality. From colonial trade routes to modern water wars, states and corporations weaponize access to rivers, oceans, and reservoirs, shaping global power struggles. And so today we're particularly going to be exploring the recent aggression between Israel and Iran, in which Israel bombed Iran, claiming it was an act of self-defense. And when Iran has retaliated, that has been called an attack in our mainstream media and condemned by our governments that are complicit in a genocide of 21 months in Gaza. And we will be particularly looking at that through the lens of the US as a naval power. And what does that mean? And how does hydropolitics come into play within this current situation that we're seeing unfolding in front of us?
Yeah. Hi everyone. And I think it's very important because we've been seeing the US pursue strategies in which they basically destabilize regions and facilitate the collapse of governments that they don't want, and create zones of instability, which they can do because they're a naval power. And so the United States is on the continent of America, but it is doing these things in the continent of Asia. So it allows them insulation from the blowback. They can pursue very necropolitical policies in those places, traditionally because nobody can see what's going on and only the media brings it back, and so they can manage that. Now what has happened in Gaza is that veneer has fallen, that mask has fallen, and people are seeing what the projection of US power and its implications really are about through its ally Israel. We take that on to what has occurred because basically the United States and Iran were in negotiations about its nuclear strategy, which it insists is for domestic usage.
Hello.
Good morning. Yeah, it's for domestic usage and for civilian and industrial usage. It's not for war. In fact, the Iranians have a fatwa which declares weapons of mass destruction haram. So according to them, they should not be doing that. However, the situation between Israel, the United States, and their actions in the region have forced the Iranians to reconsider that. So that judgment is still there, but they've had to, because they are a constitutional government and they work as a constitution. There are Jews in Iran who don't want to leave. They are in the parliament. Whilst the United States was negotiating with the Iranians about the level of uranium enrichment that they were pursuing, they're now in negotiations because the Iranians have uranium enrichment, and their uranium enrichment, it must be below a certain level. The Israelis want zero. Now the Israelis, they have nuclear weapons,
Yeah.
which are under no one's observation. The Iranian nuclear program is under observation.
Yeah.
The Israelis do not permit anyone to observe theirs, and they stole the uranium. They obtained their uranium illegally, likely from Belgium, and very likely from Congo. What we're seeing here is that amidst those negotiations, and this is the second round of negotiations, whilst the Americans sat at the table negotiating with them, good morning. Yeah. Whilst the Americans sat, they were actually making arrangements to facilitate the Israeli bombing of Iranian nuclear sites. Why is that interesting? Because the Israelis have their fleet, which bombed Iran, was around 200 planes. And so there is no way that, even in terms of refueling, they don't have the capacity to refuel. The majority of the capacity that would have been needed to refuel those planes on the length of journey that they had to make had to be at least 2/3 American. The next one is that in terms of detection and permission to fly over airspace, it is only the Americans who would have been able to negotiate that for them. There are three basic routes which you can fly into Iran from. One is the northern route, which has to pass partially over Cyprus and then Turkey, and then Iraq, and then Iran. There's the central route, which would fly across Syria, then Iraq, then Iran. Then there is the southern route, which would fly across Jordan, parts of of northern Saudi Arabia, eastern Syria, and then Iraq, and then Iran. So with 200 planes, they would have had to use all of those routes, very likely at least two. So what is very clear is that the Turks knew, the Russians in Syria would have known, the Syrians know the removal of Bashar al-Assad is the only reason that were able to commit this. Then the Jordanians knew, and Iraq, which is under the control of the United States, knew. So the United States is absolutely complicit and central to this.
Well, I mean, that's clear. I mean, in terms of what Trump's tweets, it's very clear that they're complicit and they're fully in support of this action. I mean, I don't know if you've seen Trump's tweet.
No, I've been traveling, so some things I haven't been able to control.
Yeah. So I mean,
to observe.
Yeah. So it's that in itself, it's come out and it's very clear that they are utterly complicit, and they're warmongering.
Yes.
I stopped here because there is a plant. I think that's really morning. I think that speaks to the story of hydropolitics. Himalayan balsam. Can you see how it's grown here? So it's an invasive species. It was introduced as an ornamental plant from Indian Raj. It came across on ships, and it has taken over waterways. And it has a seed that pops, and when that seed pops, it disperses its seeds for meters, and it disperses many seeds. Parts of it are actually edible. So there are people that are exploring ways of controlling it by introducing it into our food chain, etc. And there are people that do, make things with it. And in the regions where it's native to, there are parts of it that they eat, such as the pods, etc. But you have to know how to collect them because they will explode. And so now it's a major challenge of dealing with it along waterways because it causes soil erosion, it falls into rivers, it blocks waterways. As you can see, you can see the debris of it from last year here on this patch. So it's considered this incredibly invasive species and demonized, etc. When I find it a fascinating metaphor of the colonial spirit.
Please expand.
Of kind of taking this plant, bringing it here, expecting it to be tame, expecting it to just stay in its corner as you want, as a pretty little thing, and then it spreads, it takes over, and it begins to thrive and also overshadow the native species in the area. So they block out the light for them because they grow very high, etc. And so they're finding that you're seeing a reduction in native species in areas where this particular plant grows. As it gets very high, it gets taller than you, and you're 6 foot. Mm-hmm. And so I just find it really amazing. Like, there is a consequence to your actions. And here is one. It doesn't only benefit your standards of beauty or your standards of progress or what you consider to be progress. There is a broader consequence. Life thrives and it continues. And what's happened with this plant is that it's not thriving and continuing in the way that's specifically beneficial to the ecosystems here. But then we can also explore that maybe it's transforming the ecosystem.
Okay, yeah.
So I just thought that was an interesting point to bring as we're walking, because part of this is that we are also exploring these movements of politics, of power, etc. But we also need to be becoming much more curious and observant about the world around us, especially the natural world.
So that Iran has been attacked very likely by 3 routes, which indicates that that Israel has had regional support, and that the only people who could have facilitated that trans-regional support would have been the Americans.
Yeah.
And that the support or the complicity even includes Iran's ally, Russia.
And I mean, I was earlier when we were discussing what we might talk about, I was also picking on the complicity, because that flattens the nuance of what's happening, doesn't it?
Yes.
If we don't explain why they may have taken that course of action.
Well, Iran needs to exclude. Israel has taken the stance of not involving themselves in Ukraine, and the Russians need the Israelis to honor that. So it is very likely that the Russians decided that they could have plausible deniability if they just stayed out of it, because the Iranians are the ones who have supplied them with drones, but they've passed the technology on to the Russians so that they can produce the drones in Russia. So in terms of the consequences or the blowback from that decision, they just they've got less to worry about from the Iranians than they do from the Israelis.
And this is because of the Israeli kind of network of support and the impunity that they carry.
Well, you have to. A lot of the Israelis are actually Ukrainians and Eastern Europeans.
Yes.
And so they don't want those networks to become part of, which are in the United States. So they're usually Ukrainian families, etc., who live in the United States. So they don't want those networks to become active in the agitation for American support or Israeli logistic support and training of Ukrainian special forces. In terms of the attack, there's some very interesting things about the attack. The first is that the Israelis had Mossad ground support. Yeah, they had Mossad ground support. attacks were able to penetrate Iranian defenses because they had a ground operation in Iran. And all of these things point to facilitation and complicities. Any nation watching this is going to be thinking, well, they would not have done that to North Korea. Why? Right? They would not have done that to India. Why? And they're not doing it to Pakistan. Why? Because they have nuclear weapons. Right? They can't do it to China. Why? So deterrence, basically what we have entered into is a world in which negotiations, rules-based order, and treaties are not really trusted anymore, cannot be trusted, and so we enter into the region of deterrence. And there are many nations that cannot afford nuclear deterrence, and so it is very likely that we're going to see the rise of biological and chemical weapons as deterrents. The United States has just made our world a hell of a lot more unstable.
So the Americans are basically agitating for war.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see that in the UK, that's also happening, because whatever actions the Americans take, the UK have to support them.
Yes. What is occurring at this point in internationally is that there are a number of states that have deviated from the design of the state, how the state should be designed, how it should work, and how it should relate to the international order that was built by the Europeans for extraction. And there are a number of states which have deviated from that, and that deviance has to be punished. But the reality is that the Europeans themselves have completely undermined the order, and so increasingly more and more states are going to refuse to toe the line, and as a result of that, it will just undermine that whole machinery that was built for Western extraction and dominance.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why I stopped at the Balsam Tolu. That's one of the reasons why I stopped. That's one of the reasons why I stopped at the Himalayan Balsam.
Okay.
Because to me, it seemed to be very representative of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have this plant that has come in as part of that movement of European colonial extraction.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point in the future,
mm-hmm.
they have effectively lost control of how this plant is spreading, behaving, and interacting with the ecosystem.
Yes. Yes. And so if we move to the other zone in which the United States is agitating for war, which is the South China Sea, there was an event which took place in May when India attacked Pakistan in war, claiming that it was in retaliation to a terrorist incident which occurred in Kashmir, which is occupied Kashmir. And so the justification is very much like the Israeli justification. And so they attacked Pakistan. The first line of their attack, which were missiles and drones, completely penetrated Pakistani defenses. I think they called it Operation Sindoor. And Chinese defense, and Pakistani air defenses are two Chinese systems. Let's talk about them. Let's call them the HQ series. And it failed to perform as was expected. However, in the next phase of the battle, in which the Indians put up 102 planes, the Pakistanis fielded 45, and they shot down 5 Indian fighters, including 3 Russian fighters. So Rafale, the Rafale fighter, which is a French fighter, we have to acknowledge that the second largest arms exporter by value in the world is France.
Yes.
The first is United States, then France. So basically, India won the deep battle, which is about bombing targets inland, because the Pakistani air platform could not survive, did not perform as expected, and that is the Chinese system. And then, but the Indians lost the air battle to the Pakistanis, and this is really significant because in the South China Sea, the Chinese strategy is something called access denial, which means that they have layers and layers of weapon systems pointing at the region, so that anybody who let's think about it like they trip the wire, they get attacked from multiple directions, and so it dissuades them from wanting to go to war in the region. Well, that the failure of that platform to work as expected
In
Pakistan, because it's a Chinese system and because it's integral to the Chinese system in the South China Sea, it places serious questions on the viability as to whether that system is going to work, whether it's an effective system, whether the West has to worry about it in the way that they were. Because there were Chinese analysts who were saying, no, this system is far from being on par with those that we see in the West. There's also this going on. Now we have to remember that China is a nuclear power, so there are certain things that are not going to occur. I think it's last week, the Chinese fielded 2 carrier groups in the Pacific. And they're one of the few nations in the world outside of the West who's able to do that. So they are carrier groups, so aircraft carriers with planes, with drones, etc. And they're defending ships. Hello. So what we're seeing is, again, the theme of the United States as a sea power. The South China Sea is not in America's backyard. It's not the Gulf of Mexico, or the Gulf of America, as Trump would like to call it, right? It's not the zone between Greenland. It's across the world. But America is there under the guise of protecting the region.
Are they even using that guise anymore?
Yes, they're protecting the independence of Taiwan. The action of a state and an alliance which has, by their own action, made themselves less and less legitimate, who are then assuming that they can hold the position indefinitely of being the arbiters of what is just. What we're seeing is that their actions are completely destroying any kind of confidence in that system to provide the things that they say because of what they do. And as people increasingly step away from that and take more autonomous ways of dealing with their matters, then what we're seeing is that they are viewing it as a threat. And the language that they are using to describe those threats is actually increasingly racist, in the sense that anyone who does not behave like us or think like us must be dangerous.
But that's always been the case.
That's always been the case, but it is so clear because the veneer, the masks have fallen.
Okay, so we have explored the network of complicity that has made Israel's attack on Iran possible. Mm-hmm. We've also delved into the types of languages that are used to demonize anybody that doesn't subscribe to the current rules-based order, which has been in collapse for years now. But that collapse has been accelerated by the genocide in Gaza, in which we have to remember that Gaza, the last remaining fiber optic cable into Gaza was destroyed a few days ago, and so there is no internet in Gaza. So if you can buy eSIMs or anything like that to support people in Gaza right now, please do.
And who cut the
Israelis bombed
cables?
it.
Okay.
So they're under a blackout right now. So if you can buy eSIMs and make sure those are available for people there, please do, because that is how they will be able to continue communicating with the wider world.
Yeah.
And I think we will add it in as a link for where you can get these eSIMs and who's running this initiative. So we have anybody that is against the rules-based order is an enemy of the state, enemy of the world, enemy of freedom. I'm going to go this way because essentially it means that it doesn't place America as a hegemony at the center of the world.
As a hegemonic leader.
At the center of the world. That is over, and they're clinging to it, and they will spill the bloods of millions in order to do that, because they're okay with doing that. We've also looked at, these complex relationships between nations and defense systems, such as the Chinese defense system in Pakistan potentially not standing up, not being able to withstand the not being able to withstand the attack by India, but then also their defense system also being able to defend themselves against
with Chinese
aerial
fighters.
attacks with Chinese fighters. So we're in a place where we're seeing all of these complex dynamic relationships between defense systems, people making decisions based upon who they can defend themselves against and who they can't, who might be harder, hence Russia opting to possibly, if that's what happened, opting to risk the wrath of the Iranians rather than the wrath of the Israelis, which of course are in an axis of impunity with Germany, the US, the UK and France, and Canada. They have all of this support. And so we have all of these dynamics at play, but what everything seems to be pointing towards is the agitation for war.
Yes, because basically as I keep saying, the West is losing the peace. They're losing control of the order, and they're psychologically unprepared for it. So the actions that they keep taking actually worsen the conditions. It worsens their removal as the center of the system.
Okay. So
So, if we're looking at a feedback loop, we're talking about the positive feedback loop. What they do actually makes their position more and more unstable.
So basically we're heading into some very unstable times. And I think we know that, especially black and brown people living here in the West. You can feel it because you sense the changes coming.
Yes.
Very early on. And so we know that is something that is coming.
I mean, the other thing that we're looking at is that very likely we will not see measure out full-blown war across multiple regions until within 3 to 10, about at least 3 years, because they have outsourced their industrials, and they have to bring it back home in order to make that possible. So that there's a hard stop on their capacity until they sort that problem out.
In the US.
In the US, across Europe, as an alliance, France is one of the most prepared to produce its own weapons, and the United States. And we're also seeing them redesigning the security architecture of Europe in order to, in one way, to offset the heavy weight of the Turks, because the largest NATO force is first the United States, then Turkey. So what's happening is that they're really beefing up the Polish military because we've been dealing with what we call asymmetric warfare, which is warfare that you're fighting, warfare in which you're fighting enemies that are not like you, so they don't have the same kind of firepower. So what's happening is that now we're moving into symmetric warfare or conventional warfare, in which, likely in Europe, against the Russians, in which what we call mass matters, the numbers of troops, the amount of equipment that you have, because the wars are likely to go on for a long time, and that you need mass. So in that way, they need Turkey.
So what's interesting here is that I just went to do some fact checking on navies in the world. The United States is the largest and most powerful. Then the Chinese army. Russia is the third largest, followed by Japan and North Korea.
Okay. Yeah. That sounds right. More right.
Yeah. And then North Korea. The Indonesian Navy is fourth.
Fourth, Indonesian Navy. Okay. Yeah. So, but then you have the size of the Navy, and then you have to how are its weapons?
Yep.
And then how effective are they in using those? Right? So often what you're dealing with is, so the number of militaries in full scale but are not counted. Like nobody before World War I would have counted the Japanese as an effective naval force until they defeated the Russians, right?
Yeah.
And so once that happened, which is pre World War I,
Yes.
then they took the Japanese seriously.
Okay. Interesting. I think this has definitely been a ramble. It's been an exploration. But I think we can probably...
Yeah, I think so.
I think we can wrap up there. Thank you so much for listening as usual and joining us on our meanders and wanders through through hydropolitics, geopolitics, and sometimes the landscape. Okay.
Okay guys, bye.
Bye.